Hey, this is conversation number 38. Obviously, we skipped a week here. We're gonna do some bonus episodes to make up for that. We've had two skips right now, mostly due to me going to the West Coast for work and other things. I'll talk a little bit about that, what I saw, business climate, that sort of thing. But before we get to that, while I was traveling, well, I mean, on Easter, Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, passed, and
So yeah,
there's a what? Yeah. So, stuff is going on there. Josiah's a Catholic, as some of you know. I am not. So I think we're gonna have to have him take lead about what's going on here, why it matters. I guess the first thing, and I was saying that I would ask you this because I'm not quite sure what to think of it. The standard line is Francis was a liberal. Can you just explain what that means in the context of a pope? It's not like he's doing legislation, is he? I don't know.
well, yeah. I mean, they do legislation in the Catholic Church. Both for Vatican City and also canon law, ecclesial law, or whatever. Uh, Pope Francis, is he a liberal? What does that even mean in terms of Catholicism? It's tricky because the the splits between what you might call like liberalism and conservatism in the Catholic Church are, it's very profound and important for people within the church. But from an outsider's perspective, I would imagine that it kind of seems like, maybe not such a big deal, uh, or it's just narrow. So, for example, one of the controversial things that Francis did as Pope is he had this thing saying priests could bless gay couples. Right now, you're not the church is not changing its teaching on homosexuality. It's not changing its teaching on gay marriage, any of that sort of stuff. Is just saying, well, you could have some sort of like vague blessing, right? So that's a big deal from within the Catholic world, but I imagine that from an outsider perspective, it's like, well, what, like that's just whatever. Similarly, another thing was, um, whether Catholics who were divorced and remarried could receive communion, right? So this is a big controversial issue, and cause all sorts of controversy and crisis within the church. But it's not the church is not changing its teaching on divorce and the impermissibility and possibility of divorce, etc. So I mean, I have to imagine that some of the from outside secular perspective, some of the stuff maybe seems like a little small ball. I don't know. It's not, you know, the and we could talk a little bit about some of the possible replacement contenders for Francis, but there are all these people who get talked about as possible, uh, who might win the next conclave, the next election. But even the most liberal of these candidates is kind of like against abortion, say, right? So it's not. Um, so that's one weird thing. Another weird thing just has to do with Francis himself. He comes out of Argentina, which has its own maybe kind of unusual political tradition. He was when he was growing up. He was a Peronist, followed Perón. And I think, Perón is one of those kind of figures where like there were left wing Peronists and right wing Peronists. I think he was supposed to be like a right wing Peronist. So I've read a bunch of biographies of Francis, in positive ones, negative ones, and they seem to agree that up until like maybe sometime in the 1990s, he was a pretty conservative guy. Like he's not a standard liberal guy, and he went through some sort of transformation then. But what he ended up in is it's hard to say. I mean, he certainly, as Pope, tended to be allied with more progressive forces in the church, people who wanted to like update teaching to the church to be more in line with like modern sensibilities in the modern world and kumbaya, all that sort of thing. But I don't know that that was necessarily his personality. So it's hard to say. He's a bit of a cipher. I don't
Yeah,
know. As an outsider, like what if any sort of it's hard. Another issue is when you're not only a Catholic but you're like a you know you run in certain circles. You spend like a lot of time thinking and reading and talking about these issues, and you can kind of lose perspective on how much people who are not so hooked into it are even aware that a lot of this stuff is even going on. So I don't even know what's
mm,
what like what's your impression as an outsider of like Francis?
yeah. So, Francis is a type of Catholic that non-Catholic, like, liberals who are not Catholic or not even religious really like. That's one thing I noticed immediately. Like I said, don't take, like, deep personal interest in it, but I observe people talking about him, they're like, "Seems like a good guy, like, the kinda guy you wanna be pope," and I did think, I'm like, "Wait, this kinda guy you want to be pope?" Um,
Yeah,
that's
it's a
interesting because like, because
yeah.
you're not a very religious person at all. So, I have seen some of his, the things he says. He seems like, you know okay, my perspective is he did seem like a sincere person in a lot of ways. I mean, I didn't perceive him to be very Machiavellian, or he might have been, in other contexts of his life. Seemed like he's a pretty good speaker, pretty good extemporaneous speaker that could kind of express the compassionate, um, the humanitarian, not of this world. I mean, all the popes kind of did this. I mean, John Paul II, who was the pope that we were growing up, because he was John Paul II was 1978 to 2005. It was an
Correct.
incredibly long papacy. So that was the pope, not the pope in the background right now, but but but, he, I guess has a more conservative reputation, but he also would say some, like, humanitarian things. Hey, some humanitarian things that, kind of would align with the perception of non-Christians and non-Catholics, uh, with, like, what a Christian or a Catholic would say, like, a holy person, and can I just say it that way? In terms of, like, we're like regular people in the world, and we make mistakes, and we're selfish, we do things, and, do we really need to buy that car, or do we really need to spend the money on, the extension to the garage, or whatever? Like, we spend things on prosaic things that are for our own, well-being, and we know that if we gave the money to charity or something, maybe that would be, quote, "better," right? If you read the New Testament there's, like, stuff in the Book of Revelation, okay, like, there's some apocalyptic stuff in there, there's some weird stuff that, like, people don't, like, talk about that makes more sense in the context of, Judea in the 1st century AD or whatever, right? But then there's other stuff about, loving, turning the other cheek, and, like, the Prince of Peace and all this other stuff where it's like, "Oh, okay, like, that's, like, very, very, like, highfalutin humanitarian stuff." I think Francis and John Paul II were really good, at sound bites and in rhetorical, uh, responses and extemporaneously expressing that worldview, where it's like, "Oh, okay, yeah, this is what kind of someone not of this world, but of the, next world, or of the world to be better, expresses." Now, some of this is not always realistic. I remember John Paul II and also Francis, in terms of some of their anti-war stances and stuff. Sometimes I agree with it, sometimes I disagree, but it's pretty obvious they're never going to be pro-war. They're always gonna be, like, pro the underdog, and, when it comes to, say, something like, the migration crisis in Europe and Italy, where, Francis lived during that time, they're going to be soft, and frankly not realistic, because, so I saw some things, on social media which is a little unrepresentative, but, Okay, I think I told you this the other day. So, some people are so unself-reflected and unself-aware. Like some Twitter user, some anon was saying, "Look, if they nominate a black pope, I'm out." And I just quote tweeted like, "Yeah, I'm not Catholic or anything, but it's like I don't think you were ever in." You
Right.
know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's just like, it's like, we gotta pay our bills, we gotta pay the mortgage, we have some attitudes about immigration and other things based on, like, the well-being of our nation, the well-being of our families. Popes don't care about that sort of stuff as much. Like, they do. I mean, the prince, Machiavelli's The Prince was about the Pope. The Pope was a prince, for a while, was a potentate, like, in this world, but, not kind of like, since the 19th century, a lot less. The Pope is more of a
Right.
spiritual figure and the head of a church, that engages in various different moralistic, I don't wanna say crusades because like, that's a little too strong, but, it takes, like, stances on moral and ethical issues, whether it be abortion, to some extent the death penalty. Um the Catholic Church, Catholic priests have been political actors, like, a lot of people know Latin America and liberation theology, but, in South Korea during the, dictatorial not I think they were dictators, authoritarian periods, in the late 20th century, Catholics and Catholic priests were actually, like, quite involved in the pro-democracy movement. So, in South Korea, Catholics tend to support the social democratic, left-wing, liberal, party, and several of the presidents from that party have been Catholics or lapsed Catholics. I mean, I think the other side has also had Catholics, but generally the Catholics tend to be more represented on that left side, and that's partly because of the history of activism during the period of authoritarian rule. Protestants, there's a lot of Presbyterians and less Methodists in Korea. They tend to be more on the right party, I think. Anyway, so my point here is there's an intersection with the real world because the church is an actor in the real world, and that I think cuts in different directions. But also, I would say my perception of Francis as a speaker is like, okay, this guy. I mean, he's not. I mean, he would be a good Protestant preacher. Okay, is the way I would say it, because Protestant preachers they tend to have a more informal, less magisterial way of speaking to their flock, and I think Francis had that. I think John Paul had some of that too, although, when he was very vigorous, I was a little too small to really notice. I don't think Benedict had that. Benedict was a theologian, and so I think he was a different style of pope, and I don't think people had a really strong opinion of him, actually. Yeah, he was conservative, but the reality is he just wasn't a figure and a face. Because the Benedict period, Pope Benedict, recently deceased Pope Benedict, actually, who I think retired, was it in 2015 or 2013? 2013,
It was
right?
2013. Yeah.
Yeah, so after an 8-year papacy, so it was relatively short as modern papacies go, but he retired because he couldn't handle it anymore, and there's some political issues which you know about. Alright, so, yeah, so that's my perception. I know that there's all sorts of, like, political issues that, Catholics like you and I mean, mostly, like, I listen to, like, people, like not listen to, but I read and listen to people like Michael Brendan Doherty and, um, Ross Douthat, people that I know in the pundit class. I mean, I will say some of the invective against Pope Francis seems like, yeah, it seems like a little overwrought to me, but I think that's because I don't know the internal politics of the Roman Catholic Church, and there's stuff like, oh, like, he's, like, really suppressing the Latin Mass and all that stuff, and I don't really get that in terms of, like, why would you first of all, why would you suppress it? And then second of all, why would you be flipping out? You know what I'm trying to say? Like, both of them I don't get because 'cause I'm not
Well,
Catholic.
yeah. Yeah. Both yeah. Right. That's a whole thing. Before I get to that, I did wanna say it's a little ironic the person who was saying if they have a black pope, I'm out for not only for the other obvious reasons, but because the so-called based candidate to replace Pope Francis is a black African, Cardinal Sarah, who is not only like he's very conservative on all the normal stuff, but he's also anti-immigration, kind of. In fact, there are these quotes about how, from him, about how like Europe is going to lose its identity, because it's being demographically replaced by immigrants or whatever. Anyway, I find that's a little funny. But yeah.
I mean, you know what? Like, some people are so racist. They are so racist that they would rather support a gay, pro-immigration white pope. That's how
Right. Yes.
racist they
Right.
are.
Um, but yeah, so I think, just to take a broad sweep, if I wanted to, like, you know characterize like the progression of the Catholic Church over the last couple hundred years, and so for a long, long time, the Catholic Church was like a a bulwark of like traditionalism and almost reaction and opposition to the modern world, and all sorts of new like philosophies and whatever. In fact, in the 1860s, the Pope at the time, Pius IX, he came out with a document called the Syllabus of Errors, which was basically a collection of different propositions that, about human rights or whatever, that liberalism, that he thought was condemned, should be condemned. And there's 80 condemned propositions, and the 80th proposition that was condemned was something like the Roman pontiff can and should reconcile himself and come to terms with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. Right. So he's like, no, that's out. Okay. And then in the 1960s, with the Second Vatican Council, you had attempt to kind of reorient Catholicism to be less oppositional to the modern world. Right. Sort of, stop that oppositional stance and reconcile yourself. The Roman Pontiff reconciled himself to progress, liberalism, modern civilization. And after that, there was a period of what I would describe as like kind of chaos. People didn't really know how much, like, everything seemed like it was kind of up for grabs. You got rid of Latin in the Mass, which was a big tangible impact for people, and people were saying that all sorts of doctrines were going to get thrown out the window, whether it's contraception or priestly celibacy or so on and so forth. And so that was kind of like a period of chaos. And then when John Paul II came in, he kind of stabilized things, and he did not return really to that um, pre Vatican II, way of doing things, but he kind of stopped the chaos and said that there was not going to be any further, no more changes, right, basically, and tried to like create some sort of new um synthesis. Okay. And Benedict continued that. Maybe he even started to go back a little bit in terms of like more use of the Latin Mass and some other things. And so the Latin Mass, I think it's important to people, not only, for its own reasons, because of its, beauty, its sanctity, its history or whatever, but it also became a kind of symbol, where it was associated with people who were more of a traditional bent, who more thought that the changes and reorientation of the church after Vatican II was a mistake, and that you needed to kind of go back. And so Francis, part of the reason why he's kind of hostile and wanted to suppress it is because he feels like it's feeding into that, right? It's giving strength to those, what he would consider reactionary forces, who want the church to return um, to that way of viewing things, and he doesn't want that. He wants to kind of move forward and further reconcile the church with like the modern world and other churches, other religions, etc. Right. So that's why it can seem like kind of like a weird flashpoint. Um, but often this is the way, right? I mean, it's in Russia. I think when they did liturgical reforms in like the 16th century, 16th, 17th century or whatever, one, like, there was a huge controversy about when you cross yourself, do you do it with two fingers or do you do it with three fingers, right? I don't even remember which one they said was bad, but there was one that's like, oh, you do three because of the Trinity, and other people were like, no, you do two because it represents the hypostatic union of God and man, and people died over this stuff, right? So they take it becomes like very very serious, and fortunately, I don't think that many people have died over these conflicts over the Latin Mass, but you know, it is important to people, right? And I'm sure, like if our friend Michael Brendan Doherty were here, I think he thinks it's even more important. Like I mean, it's like I think he said that you change the mass, you kind of change the religion, right? You have a new mass, you have a new religion, um, almost. So yeah, these are the sort of things that particularly if you're like a Catholic nerd, right? You
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, from the American perspective, whether you're religious or not, American Protestants, um, Catholicism, the importance of liturgy, the ritual, this sort of stuff, almost not the almost like the literal, the belief of Catholics is there is magic, like in these rites and these rituals in terms of sacrament, transubstantiation, the real presence
right,
of Christ, right there. So that's not a thing in most of American Protestantism, and in fact, so the dominant tradition is kind of, like it's kind of a radical Protestant tradition where, it's there's not there's not like this old world magic in the church. The church is a place of, like worship and fellowship and that sort of thing. And so I think it's really difficult sometimes for Americans to understand why people be tripping about this sort of stuff. I mean, this is not just, by the way, Catholics. The emphasis on practice and the right is like super important in orthopraxic religion. So in Islam,
right.
when people pray, like you've seen people pray, the people have their hands in front of them, and whether your hands are like hanging down low, kind of like towards the bottom of your abdomen, or like high, maybe towards more your navel, is actually a distinction between different prayer styles of different like legal schools.
Mhm.
So when I was the TLDR is when I was a kid, I remember like Salafi, basically is, so Saudi Arabian money was coming in to mosques, and, they have a particular style where they hold the hand a little higher, um, when they're standing, and they were telling people that's what you should do. That's actually like I think that's like a Shafi Hanbali style. It's a particular legal school that happens to be dominant in Saudi Arabia. So it wasn't really anything to do with Islam, it was just, like, their normative practice, and since they were bringing the money, they were like, "You should do it like us because that's the right way to do it." And then there
Yeah.
was, like, a huge argument, and I think my perception is, because I'm not, like, in touch with the Islamic community, my perception is people realize, "Wait a second, this is just stupid." I mean, it's like literally like you're talking like, 3, 4 inches and like, we're having an argument. And I think the Saudis were like, this is not the most important thing. We're not gonna like stress, we're not gonna trip about that, right? But my only point is, these details of practice, details of ritual that like unite a community, uh, are very important to people because they unite a community. It's like, these are the rules that we agree to. This is how we do it. Like if you go to a church where, there's some churches where it's like, there's not necessarily a dress code, but everyone, like all the males show up in like, a jacket or, whatever.
Right.
There are other churches where like there are people in polos, people in t-shirts. Well, it's just like the community norm, right? In Catholicism and Roman Catholicism, you have customs and traditions that go back literally thousands of years, and those have been the rules that have kind of like united people across centuries, across literal millennia, from the time of Rome down to the present. And so I think like, when you imbue it with supernatural qualities, you imbue it with magical qualities, I mean magical like white magic, not like in some pejorative
Numinous.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like of course people are gonna be very, very preoccupied with it. But the problem is, I just said, transubstantiation. I think, like, for a lot of the listeners, even though our listeners are more conservative, that's gonna be like, "Okay, wait, what does that mean again?" They're going to, like, Wikipedia. So, unless you're a Catholic nerd, it doesn't hit because they don't know all the reference, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have to imagine that even for most Catholics, it's a little hard to say because there's a lot of people who are Catholic, but they, are totally disengaged. They never even go to church or whatever. And, Maybe they don't even believe in God. I don't know, but they say they're Catholic. They're raised Catholic or whatever. So that's one group. But then even among, you know, people who do regular mass goers or whatever, it's not clear to me how much they're even kind of aware of a lot of this stuff, these controversies or whatnot. You have to be pretty hooked in order to be aware to most of it. And maybe that's even healthier in a way because there's not. They have all sorts of opinions on all sorts of things that I have no control or influence over, right? Like I don't. I have opinions about who should be the next pope or who shouldn't be the next pope or whatever, but I don't get a vote. I don't have a say. No one cares what I think about that, right? So maybe it would be easier, better if I just didn't even know about it. If I just wasn't even aware of like the latest controversy or the latest statement that Pope Francis or some other bishop or somebody else said, right? But at the same time, um, even though most people are probably not engaged with it, I do think these things matter. I think these changes matter. I think that um, you can kind of see over the last, I mean, you just to step away from Catholicism, for example, Protestantism is very, um, it's more decentralized, right? And so in the United States, you have kind of seen different church groups go in different directions. Some have kind of fully they've embraced the path that the progressives want, right? And so you go, you kind of sometimes you pass a church and it has like a rainbow flag out and it has Black Lives Matter and maybe there's a cross, I don't know. And you go in and there's on Sundays female pastor and there's like maybe 8 people in the church, right? And they're all average age 65, right? 68 years old. um so some churches, it's the mainline Protestant denominations, a lot of them have embraced that path, and it does not really seem like it's really worked for them. I would say, it hasn't. Um,
Yeah, let me
yeah, they're
let me
dying.
jump in here because you're using some terms. The mainline Protestants kind of, this is like just refers really to the dominant Protestant denominations in the United States. Like, let's just like, define it like in 1950 or something like that. These are like the Episcopal Church, which is where like a huge number of presidents are Episcopalian, comes out of the Anglican tradition. And upper middle class, upper class, stereotypically Americans, Anglo American, part of the Anglican Communion, and then so they have bishops and everything like that, and then you have Presbyterians, who are basically like comes out of kind of Calvinist tradition. Congregationalists are associated with them, but they went like even more liberal. So there's Presbyterians, but the issue is like in these mainline churches, there's also usually like a conservative branch of the churches that are not necessarily mainline, more evangelical. There's Presbyterian Church USA, which is still, I think, marginally. I looked at the numbers. It's not actually as big as you would think, but it's marginally still like the more numerous church. It's liberal. I think they have female pastors and everything like that. Okay, the Presbyterian Church in America,
Right.
which some of people we know, like my our friend Jeremy Carl, and that is an evangelical Presbyterian church. And there's also, I think, like there's an Anglican church in America which is like super conservative, and so it's one of these things where like on some like supposedly deep theological or like historical questions, the Presbyterian Church in USA and America do share a lot in common, but when it comes to socio-political and maybe like more like contemporary religious questions like the inerrancy of the Bible, the Presbyterian Church USA would have more in common with the Episcopal Church, whereas the Presbyterian Church America would have more in common with, I don't know, like the Missouri Synod
Right.
Church of Evangelical, with Lutheran Church, which is the conservative Lutheran branch, as
Right.
opposed to the Evangelical Church USA. So just to, for like, the secular people out there and non-Americans, you have all these denominations in America, and they come from like, okay, like Lutherans, you know what Lutherans are, you know what Presbyterians are, like, in Europe it would be like more of the Reformed Church, like in the Netherlands, although we have our own Dutch Reformed churches, that's an ethnic church kind of. But
Yeah.
there's that. We have a lot of Baptists, obviously. I mean, Baptists are much smaller number in Europe, but they're around. They're a much bigger church here in the USA, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, those would be the main ones. There's Methodist, which comes out of kind of originally Episcopal. It comes out of like the American Anglo-American tradition and kind of like the more low church tradition in Episcopalianism. But Methodists also, they tend to be liberal. United Methodist is like the main line of the mainline churches stereotypically, but and Hillary Clinton was Methodist, that sort of thing. Bill would go to her Methodist church, but there's actually also like there's Free Methodists, there's also Evangelical Methodists as well, and so Americans always have this like all these different churches, and they like hit all these like ideological spectrums, and people go church shopping, and like I think that sounds like a little offensive to. I mean, Europeans have told me that that's like an offensive term. Like, what do you mean you don't go shopping? You know what I'm saying? But it's just like,
All right. Well,
that's just
what like I guess Europeans don't like shopping in general, but I don't know.
Yeah, like they feel like what someone was like. It's like it should not be a consumerist thing, is what they said. But anyway,
right. Okay.
it's
Well,
it's just but I mean but that is the context of America where it's like you can like go and like you ideologically, culturally, socioeconomically, so like in the American South traditionally, this is like I think changed a little bit, but it was like your class status, um was as a white, let's say white Southerners, your class status strongly was correlated with the church you went to. Like, if you're like lower class, white, you might be Pentecostal, maybe Baptist. Baptists are like a little higher than Pentecostals, and then above them are Methodists, and above them are Presbyterians, and then the planters would be Episcopal.
yeah.
So there, there's a church, or there's a university, the University of the South, I think is what it's called now. It used to be called Seoane, and it was an Episcopal private college, and that the rich Southern elite would go to. And unlike other Christian colleges in the South, it was a little bit more like very chill about the religion part. So
Right.
that's the one thing I would say. That's like atypical for Southern Protestants who tend to be like very, have a lot of fervor since the Second Great Awakening. Anyway, that's like a little historical sociological context. I think it gets a little confusing for non-Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's I would say that's a path. The Catholic Church also, I think if you have to look whether it's who actually shows up, like church attendance, how many people are becoming priests, how many people are getting married in the church, all these other things. These numbers are very bad, but that's not just true for Catholics. It's a general kind of secularization across the developed world, and Latin America. I also, to some extent, I would say there are places like Africa or whatever where the church is kind of booming, but in a lot of the traditional, Christian societies, historically Christian societies, uh, Christianity seems like it's kind of fading and it's becoming like kind of like a more cultural thing. And how do you deal with that? And how do you respond to it? Um, that seems like that's a big issue that I think is like the church has to address, and people have different strategies of like how you deal with that. And then what do you do with like other religions, with other denominations, and I think you can kind of get pulled in all sorts of different directions because people will say, for example, that the Catholic Church needs to like liberalize or do various things with respect to you know women in the church or other political issues in order to better align with some of the other um, Western groups. But then we also want to try and reunite with like Eastern Orthodoxy or other things like that, where that sort of stuff would draw us further away, like LGBT stuff or whatever. So those are, maybe that's not even the right way to be thinking about it if you're supposed to be the vicar of Christ on earth. But I know that people do think about those sorts of things, and um, especially after Francis and his kind of moves in that direction and the like consternation that caused. I guess the like question is, do you want to try like for the next pope? do you want someone who's going to kind of like double down full steam ahead on that? Do you want someone who's kind of like kind of back off, maybe consolidate a little bit? Do you want someone who maybe will try and chart a new course and reverse course somewhat? Those are things that I guess like the Cardinals are going to have to decide when they have the conclave in a week or two. It's not going to be that long.
Yeah, yeah. Who's running the Catholic Church while there's no pope?
There's uh like the curia basically. So the Pope, he's got basically like his cabinet, I guess you would call it. He's got a Secretary of State, and he's got these other offices. And when he's gone, there's like a setup that's in place that can kind of run things, temporarily until the new pope comes in. Frankly, as with all, major organizations, the bureaucracy, like 90% of it runs itself now, like same with the US government or, other things, right? It can just continue to operate. Eventually you would have like big decisions, um, but in the past, I mean, I just finished reading a book about the 1559 conclave that elected Pope Pius IV, and that took 6 months. That was from July, I think, until December of 1559, right? So that there have been some conclaves that have gone for multiple years. In fact, the reason why now they sequester all the cardinals, and the reason why they do that is because originally it was just taking too long. The Cardinals were not sequestered or whatever, and they would just like take years to try and pick a new successor. And so finally they decided, okay, look, this is what we're going to do. You all have to go into this room, and you're not allowed to leave, until you come up with somebody, right? That's where the conclave originally comes from, back in the like 12th century or something.
Hmm. Yeah. I guess, like, the question that I have, now that we're still talking, let's just finish up on the Pope, the Catholic stuff, is, what is, like, the practical ramification, I guess, for the rest of us? So let's say you have Cardinal Sarah, like, the conservative, okay, and, what does that mean? Or what if you have the liberal, which I don't know who that is, but probably someone in Latinx America or the Filipino guy or whatever. I mean, what is and, like, if you were telling me that I guess only 17% of the Cardinals are now Italian, so probably,
Right.
unlikely to be an Italian. So, what is the relevance what is the relevance for the rest of us?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess it kind of all depends. The Pope is an international figure. He speaks on a lot of issues. To be honest, he, I think his place in public life is less than it used to be, because it used to be people wanted to listen to the Pope because there were a billion Catholics or however many Catholics in the world, and they would listen to the Pope. So if the Pope said something, they would go along with it. Or these days, the Catholic Church, I would say, has lost a lot of that authority, both because of secularization, because of the abuse crisis, because of other things. And so when the Pope speaks now, mostly people, I mean, it's not that no one listens, but his influence, I would just say, is greatly diminished. And so that's probably going to be true regardless of whoever the next pope is that he'll say some stuff, and if you're interested you can follow it, but you know if you're not interested you can just tune it out, and it won't necessarily affect your life, right? I think it's probably a bigger issue um in other parts of the world, and like the Catholic Church is a universal organization. So, for example, one thing that Francis did was, there's been a longstanding issue in China with the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church was like officially, you had official bishops, who were approved by the CCP, and then you also had underground bishops or whatever, and who were more persecuted. And Francis worked out some sort of like deal to regularize things, but depending on who you talk to, it was kind of like endorsing the CCP version church or whatnot. So if you were a Catholic in China or even a non-Catholic in China, those are things that could have uh, like real effects on your life. And there are other places in the world, you know, um, I mean, here's a possibility. So one of the kind of dark horse candidates is this Cardinal Pizzaballa. And I think part of the reason why he gets attention is because he has a funny sounding name, Pizzaballa. I'm not even sure if that's how you pronounce it, but it is Pizzaballa. So it's Pizzaballa. Anyway, he is the he's the Latin patriarch of Jerusalem, right? And so if he becomes the Pope, I expect that that will have a lot of implications and other things, you know, for the church in the Middle East and other things because he's there in Israel. And of course, Israel's big in the news and stuff in Gaza. And he's definitely got opinions and perspectives on that, right? So that's another area where the Pope could who the Pope is could potentially play a big role. Overall, I mean, it's like most things that are in the news don't actually affect your life if you don't want it to, right? You can just ignore it, and probably if you're not a Catholic and you want to just ignore it, you have that option. I guess I would say.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. I think, yeah, I think in America, from American perspective, it's just all, like, kind of, like, watching a spectacle of the politics and, and the Catholic nerds, like, nerded out, but, I mean, the church is a big institutional force in a lot of poorer countries in particular. It has a its teachings can affect the policy of those countries, but also, it's a massive, redistribution organization, you know? Like, it
Right.
provides a lot of social welfare and, the way it relates to governments has a big deal. I mean, I think this wasn't Ben it was John Paul, not Benedict. This was, I think, right before John Paul. It might have been Benedict, during I think maybe it was Benedict, the cartoon, the Danish cartoon thing,
That was Benedict, yeah.
and that was Benedict, and, Benedict said some harsh things about Islam, obviously, and, you know, uh yeah, anyway, but he was also trying to be a little bit compromising in certain ways, and some people were like, "Why are you being such a cuck?" And other people pointed out, "Look, he has to, like, he has, like" there's a lot of Christians in communion. I mean, there's not that many Roman Catholics, but there's a lot of, Eastern churches that are, under the umbrella of the Roman Pope, you know,
Yeah.
of the Roman,
Not as many
of the Pon
anymore, sadly, but yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so they had to worry about that, like, in places like Iraq. The Chaldean church is, I think, in communion with Rome, and it was a much bigger church back even back then. I mean, I think over the last, like, 20 years, it's, like, declined a lot as people have gotten out of there. And even then, like, the Coptic Christians are not in communion with Rome, but, I think, like, the Roman Catholic Church, feels like kind of a kinship, obviously, with the Oriental churches and, whatever East, West, and all these beefs that people use, Chalcedonian, non-Chalcedonian, or whatever beefs people have. Ultimately, the reality is, you know, to be candid, like American evangelical Protestants can be a little like schizophrenic about, like on some levels they're like, oh yeah, yeah, we're like in solidarity with fellow Christians, but then they're really philo-Semitic and the alignment with Israel, and sometimes they're like, okay, well, we'd rather pick Israel over. I mean, they're kind of like they've kind of gone down a false path anyway. You know what I'm saying? Like they'll say things like that, or I think the funniest story is like there's a book about Eastern Christians that I was reading, and like I've heard this, like, on the radio too, where it's just like, some Americans, and usually a stereotypically Southern person, will ask, Palestinian Christians because they wear the cross, like, when they became Christian,
Right.
which
Yeah.
Palestinian Christians do not like that.
Yeah.
Especially because 'cause they're usually service people, so, like, they can't, like, say anything snarky, you know? They
Right.
just have to explain, "Well, there was this guy,
Yeah.
Jesus."
That's right. 2,000 years ago.
Anyway, so but you know the Catholic Church, you know, is a global institution, involved in global politics, and so that individual makes decisions. I mean, arguably, I mean, you know, William F. Buckley of National Review. I think this is like a debatable point, but it's a point. He thinks that John Paul II, the Polish Pope, was instrumental in the fall of communism. You know,
Yeah.
because
I
obviously
think
he
I
took a
mean,
special interest. Yeah,
right. Yeah, I think and I think you have to say that um he played a role, right? You could debate about how big a role or whatever, but he definitely played a role. And so, the institution mattered then in a way that it just doesn't as much now. It's like the royal family, like people still um have a lot of interest, in what's going on with Charles and William and Kate and Meghan Markle and all that sort of stuff. But they don't have influence the way that they did in times past, right? And I think that's probably also kind of true from a secular worldly point of view with the popes. It used to be that they could make or break empires, and then even that they had a significant role in geopolitical events or whatever, and that seems like it's becoming less and less true.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, so we've been talking for a while, and I think maybe we'll pay well after this part. Like, let's talk about a little bit about. I'll talk about a little about economics. So
Yeah,
we'll pay well after this. Okay, so I was in California partly for business. Don't get into details. I have a new role, trying to look for business partnerships, and I'm still trying to raise a little bit of money for some of the companies that I am advising for. And also, I did go to Yosemite, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my observations about national parks that I saw. Well, in terms of so I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and I've been to Olympic National Park. I lived near Crater Lake, actually for a while. So I have some points of comparison. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. So, in terms of economic stuff, what I will say is, we are starting to see some major uh, constipation is the way I'm going to describe it, in terms of business activity. There are already layoffs planned, because basically startups, smaller companies are going to reduce their burn rate. um, Bigger companies are worried about, what's gonna happen in the supply chain. One of the things that someone pointed out to me is a little bit like Obamacare. You have to do it to figure out, what's in it. Nobody really knows for a lot of companies, nobody really knows the whole supply chain, right? Like they get it, they might get something from suppliers in Vietnam, but they don't know what
right.
they're doing. And so,
They might, I
what?
mean, they might get something. You might get something from a supplier, and you think, okay, it's safe because it's American, but then you don't know that that supplier is getting something from Vietnam,
Which
or
is getting
whatever.
something from China.
Right.
I mean, these are the sort of things because ultimately, because the issue is like, if people figure out, oh, it's from China, like, what does that do? And um, we're running a huge natural experiment. We're running a huge natural experiment, economically, and just we talked about tariffs like a lot, and maybe I should like put my MAGA hat on and just show that I'm not a lib. I don't know, but I don't know what to say because just like we've talked to friends IRL, and it's just like I do express frustration because it's just like, well, he knows better than us, and like it's not really retarded, it's genius.
Right.
It's
Right.
just like, my first instinct is like, well, but if it sounds retarded, I'm gonna say it's retarded. Like, maybe it is genius. I don't know, but like, I'm not gonna just say something that doesn't make sense makes sense, you know? And so, I will say that, obviously the probability of recession is pretty high. It's not guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed in social science and like, the volatility of human action. But it seems like pretty high because one thing that's happening is, consumer sentiment is low, but people are still buying, because they feel like they have money. But businesses and the market anticipates. The market's been very volatile, up and down. The treasury bills, Last I checked, there's still so just so people know, basically the T-bills, the bond market, these bonds in American debt. What happens is the bonds in like a company or a city or a state, the interest rate is determined by the faith that you will repay, and it's kind of the confidence in you as an institution. And so, if you're a very, very stable country that has a really good track record, you get low interest rates. That's good for you because you're paying out the interest rates as you're going along, because the interest rates are part of your costs. So, interest rates on our debt service and stuff like that, they will go up when our treasury bills go up. And so, if you are seen as a bad risk, you pay a high interest rate. And so, our interest rates are going up because of volatility in terms of President Trump's policies, right? So, that's not great. But the other macroeconomic things that we haven't really hit is like there's two things. The stuff on the supply chain is going to be start to really kick in around the first of it is going to really start to kick in around like May 1st, and then it's going to be rolling waves until the end of the month. Okay, and so we're going to actually see what is going to be in shortage, what prices are going to jump, what things are going to disappear. So it's not going to be Annus Horribilis, but it'll be like the month Horribilis or whatever. We'll figure that out. Okay. The second issue that I want to like emphasize here is capital, like in terms of like businesses and the capital class, which is like not like people like me and Josiah who are, okay, middle class people, maybe a little above the middle class, but you know what I'm saying. In terms of like, we're not like the 50th percentile, but we're not like the 0.1%. Okay. There's like the 0.1, 0.001%. These are people with vast sloshes of capital, and they are driving the productivity in the economy by their investment of their capital instead of just consumption. Uh, those people, along with businesses, they're frozen right now. Okay, and they're frozen because they don't know what's going to happen in the future. Now, Trump could like undo the tariffs or limit them just to China, because there's like 10% tariffs on everything else, right? Um, but or he couldn't. We don't know. You know, that's the issue because he has fiat power and he's a very volatile person in this way. And so basically, uh, people are now waiting. So business uncertainty is high. That means business investment is low. Part of the economy is the investment of businesses. Businesses like opening new offices, hiring new employees, expanding, their factory or whatever. And so that is going to be drag on the economy. In terms of like angel investors, like rich people like that, they're rich. They can wait things out. They can wait things out a really, really long time. They don't need to invest their money, and so they're not going to. And again, that's something like business investment and the supply chain that I think we as consumers, as regular Americans, are going to feel only down the line, and we're not going to immediately feel it right now. And the sentiment, the economic sentiment in the public is already declining a lot, but that's only based on vibes. The real pain has not hit. The real pain will hit in the next month or two, and Trump is already experiencing significant erosion in his support. And I guess what I say to people is like, again, like I mean, basically, a friend of ours, I mean, Justin Murphy, we can just say who it is. Like, Justin's not an anonymous type person. He was like, well, he thinks like maybe Trump could bring it back by 2026. And, you know, there's already thermostatic structural problems with midterms for the presidential party, right? And this is very early. He's losing support. And the problem is, even if everything goes back to the status quo ante, the problem is you have lost confidence now. You know?
Yeah.
Like, if you think in terms of a business person, your confidence in the stability of the conditions is decreased significantly, and so we're already above our baseline, and, so, I'm not, like, super excited for my own personal finances, they'll be okay. What I'm, like, really not excited for is, like, degraded macroeconomic conditions, and then, America being poorer, more angry, and, probably less stable, frankly. So that's how I'm feeling right now about, the economy and what I saw, and, people aren't panicking. What I will say is there's just a sober understanding that we are now in a new normal and people have reduced expectations. And I don't think that the public is going to be happy when it passes from the executive class and the investor class to the public.
Yeah. I think I'm a little bit worried. I mean, I'm not. I think one reason why the markets have not reacted even more strongly than they have is because I mean, I think there is a sense that if things start to get really bad, Trump will just change course, right? I mean, he already did a little bit where he had all the tariffs and then he said, okay, we're going to suspend, you know, a lot of them, right? Not all of them, but a lot of them, and we're going to try and work out deals or whatever. And um, I don't. I mean, I don't. I am s- skeptical. I remember talking with Justin, and his point, which I think is broadly reasonable, is like, look, Trump. Um, you know, he's not a dumb guy, right? He's got a long track record of success, and so he's got to have some plan. And if it looks stupid, then maybe there's some other element there that he's trying to do, and this is just like a smokescreen or whatever. I mean, as I say it, it doesn't sound very plausible, but there's something to it where it's like it's almost the case that the more idiotic something seems, the less you can believe that that's really just all there is. There's got to be something more, right? So whether it's negotiation or whatnot, or just if things start to go really south, he can always just change his mind. So like, would Trump, even if Trump, I think, does have these views that trade deficits are just inherently bad or whatever, but if the bond market, if the U.S. starts to look like it's going to go into some sort of debt crisis or fiscal crisis or whatever because of the stuff, would he really just stick with it? I don't think so. I think we've already kind of seen that a little bit, right? Just on a mini scale. So maybe that kind of I think that probably limits your downside damage, unless you reach some kind of tipping point or other cascade type thing, right? That's always possible. Um, One thing that worries me a little bit is some of this stuff, it plays out like the stock market, you can watch that in real time, but some of this stuff kind of plays out over a longer time period where, you know, decisions get made now, but people don't really start feeling the pain until 6 months from now, at which point time, some of the damage has already been locked in, right? So, um, I think if you look at the markets, there's a lot of potential in the U.S. economy. The markets want to go up. They want to be like, yeah, the economy can be really great. And it seems like this tariff stuff and other stuff is really the only thing that's really holding it back. But if it goes on long enough, that could become, you know, harder to undo, I guess you would say. So that's maybe my worry. Um, and My portfolio actually has not been doing that badly, frankly, because I got a lot of bonds and gold. The gold has been doing
Mhm.
very well, you know.
Yeah,
So
countercyclical.
actually, so overall, it's kind of canceled out. It's basically just been flat, because my stocks are down and the gold is up, and um, but I mean, like in terms of the real economy, uh, I think we saw from COVID that a lot of people are just not able to believe that something bad could happen until it happens, and sometimes not even then. Um, so I don't know. That's not that cheery prospect.
Yeah, I mean, the issue with the economy is a complex system, and so when you, like, kinda, like, smash a complex system, you don't know what the ramifications are. Now, this is actually one of the arguments for the tariff defenders, for, like, kinda like the crazy, like, extreme nature of it. They're like, "Well, you need to, like, break up the complex system so we can put it back together," and stuff like that, and I'm just like, "Uh." I mean, it's interesting because a lot of these people are, like, in theory, conservatives, so,
Right.
um, do you see what I'm saying? I mean, and normally, like, in other situations, you would be like, "Wait a second,
Yeah,
you don't
it's
know what
never
the ramifications are gonna be, of, like, well, let's just try it, let's just try it."
right.
It's like, "Well, I mean,
Yeah.
wait, what?" I don't know. I mean, yeah. I guess what I would say is like, a lot of people, one of our friends, there's a lot of people are saying, well, we need to do something about China. I'm like, yes, but like, doesn't mean we need to do this, you know? I mean, there's now like a consensus in both parties that the whole Chimerica period well, it wasn't a total failure, but it definitely is not going the direction that we thought it was going to go. Xi Jinping is not ushering in a kind of like a liberal China or anything like that. On the contrary, we're in a Thucydides trapish situation. Okay, so we need to figure it out. We need to decouple. Uh, this is not. I mean, this is like we're tearing the band-aid off, and like when you tear the band-aid off, like if it didn't heal underneath, it's gonna bleed, and that's the issue. And China has all these exceptions on our tariff, on our goods coming in, and we have exceptions on Chinese goods, and I mean it's like we're not really actually biting the bullet in a way. There's all these exceptions indicate that we are still super dependent on each other. To not be dependent on China is going to be like it's going to be like a 5 to 10 year process, and even that is probably pushing things, but whatever. And like that's what we would have to do, And both the Chinese and the Americans, like we both know we need to do it because, um, we got different interests and things are at cross purposes right now. They don't want to depend on us in some ways as like an export market, and we don't want to depend on them as a source of some of these cheap goods and services. But it's not just the cheap. It's not just like toys and trinkets. Like that's what people say. Like obviously with like a lot of like the higher end electronics, um, China has economies of scale and it has like systems that have been built up over decades. You can't just like recreate those overnight. I think the best case scenario from Trump's perspective, like a month ago, would be like you make these like wild, this art of the deal stuff. You make these like wild moves, and they come back at you with something that's reasonable, moderate, and like just it's a good deal on both sides. It's win-win in some ways, right? But that's not really what's happening. What's happening is everyone's just like, oh, you're like a madman, and we're just gonna hunker down. I mean, that's what the business sentiment is. The business sentiment is definitely a hunker down sentiment, and so that's like recessionary, anticipatory of a recession. But also like our international like capital. So we've talked a little bit about this. The hostility with Canada, which was like just weird. Look, I put it. Like, I am pro annexation of Canada as a territory. Okay, I actually do agree with that. But it's like saying that they're going to be the 51st state. There's two issues. One, a lot of Republicans are not going to want Canada as the 51st state, even if it's just a single state. It's going to be two blue senators and a lot of blue representatives. Because it's the population of California now. Okay, so nobody would want it as 54th state who's a Republican. And secondarily, it's like pissing the Canadians off to the point where they're electing a liberal government that's going to be more hostile to the United States. Also, like trade and travel and commerce and all those things with our northern neighbor are decreasing, and that is the biggest basically undefended border in the world. The fact that we don't have to quote worry about Canada, and Canada doesn't have to worry about us is basically like a tax break. Because borders are kind of a tax. Like you got to like patrol the border, you got to arm the border, you got to like track the border, and all these things. And the Canadian border is very very like low stress for us. But Trump's like goosing up these cross border hostilities means that like there is a non-trivial like increase now in tensions. I still think I mean obviously it's extremely low. We're not going to invade Canada or anything like that. But that sort of behavior like decreases our capital stock in terms of like their social diplomatic capital, which we rely on because at some point, we need to create a system of alliances that encircle China. That's just like fundamentally what it is. It seems like the Trump administration is doing a pretty good job with India for various reasons. But we kind of hosed Vietnam, and the Vietnamese. I know from like I've done podcasts with people that lived in Vietnam. They were extremely pro Trump because they thought he was against China. But, I don't know if he wasn't paying attention or his people, like, didn't notice, but, the tariffs obviously hit Vietnam really hard, and, it hit really Vietnam really hard. I mean, I think that, again, they reduced it to 10%. But the issue is Vietnam is a major exporter to the United States because people are switching to Vietnam to get out of China, which is what we want, right? So anyway, this sort of stuff, seems dumb, seems retarded, and, that's just how I feel, and I don't really see the mad overarching genius in all of this. So I'm just gonna say it. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, it will thrill me in a way if it turns out that actually there is some sort of 4D chess involved and the market skyrockets and everything goes great or whatever, obviously I would be very happy for that. And Also, if Trump just decides to change course and comes up with some explanation about how he um, achieved a stupendous victory, even though nothing's really changed, that would also be fine with me. I'll take it, and I'll listen to you know, uh, you know, if MAGA friends want to say "I told you so" in that circumstance, okay, I'm not gonna, I'll hold my tongue.
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess, like, I'm still bearish, I haven't updated. I haven't gotten more bearish, I've just gotten more confident. So, I'm just saying in terms of, like, taking stock of, Bay Area tech people that have some money and that are doing some hiring and firing, and, there's mutuals of ours who've gotten laid off and things like that. We're starting to see things happen. Like, stuff is happening out there, it's not good. So, I guess the last thing I wanna talk about is, so I went to Yosemite, Kings, and Sequoia, National Park. So these are in the High Sierra Nevadas, very nice national parks. And Yosemite has some really, really pretty views. It was a really quick trip. Didn't stay very long. But one thing I would say, I never actually, I went to UC Davis for grad school, but I never actually ended up going to Yosemite. So I finally went. I mean, I've been in the Sierras before, and I've been to Redwood National Park and like the coastal areas a lot, actually in California. But I haven't been like to the High Sierras too much. So this was my first time. Um, so Yosemite has sidewalks. It has sidewalks in the park, okay? There's a lot of lodges, there's a lot of eateries, there's a lot of people just driving, and in the main valley. Obviously, there are a lot of hiking trails that are pretty secluded and whatnot. But by El Capitan and by all the falls and everything like that, um, it feels like a massive urban park. And it's just really interesting to me how our national parks are, some of these national parks are like very wild. So like North Cascades National Park, like in Washington State, is like pretty wild. Like nobody really goes there, stuff like that. Olympic Peninsula, a lot of it is like pretty remote. You will starve. You will starve in a lot of the Olympic national park, right? Um, but in if, like, your car breaks down and you have no cell phone reception in that valley, you're fine. You just wait on the road and someone will swing by, or you just, like, walk towards the nearest lodge or just, like, walk in any random direction, you're gonna run into something. Because it's an enclosed valley, and, as we were leaving in the evening, you can see, like, all the lights of all the cars on the valley floor. Like, it feels
Mhm.
like a very, very, yeah, it feels very, very, urban. It was weird.
Yeah.
And, in terms of the people, I do have to say, these are like they have hiking trails and things like that. I saw more. I think like if I was woke, I would say diverse body shapes. You know?
Okay.
Like I saw like more of like the full range of America that I don't see in my more like,
So
professional managerial class
these are like baddies hiking, or
yeah, as a friend of ours would say, Amerifats.
Democrats. I mean,
So, I was kinda
they're
proud.
out. I mean, that's good. They're
Yeah, I
getting
was actually proud of them. I was actually proud of them, but, like, I was like, because we went, okay, the walk, it was at, I think it was at, I think this is in Kings, or no, it's in Sequoia. General Sherman, the biggest tree in the world, I think it's General Sherman, not General Grant. General Grant's is in Kings. But, so General Sherman, like, it's a grove of giants, right? And you go down almost a mile, it's like point 0.8 miles. You go down, it's, like, not super steep, it's moderately steep, and you come back up, and, yeah, it was just interesting to see, how many Americans, of size are still trying to do what they're trying to do. So, that was kind of, like, positive, but in another way, it was also like, "Okay, yeah, because people talk about Americans being obese and stuff like that. I just don't see it that much, um, because like my social milieu, in terms of
yeah.
like younger professional managerial people. But you see it. I'm like, whoa. There's a lot of non-Americans, a lot of Asians. There were a lot of Asians and a fair number of Europeans, like Germans, like you could hear it. We were not at high season, we were close. And a lot of Indians, a lot of Chinese, and then a lot of Germans is what I noticed. So probably about half international and half American. And, again, like, the shape difference between the international and the Americans was, like, very striking. Since it was It's actually pretty close to Fresno and several Central Valley cities, Yosemite and Kings and Sequoia. There are many, many Latinos, I would say. Um, so there is a stereotype. There is a stereotype, which is not totally unfounded. Like John Muir was instrumental in Yosemite being preserved and starting the Audubon Society. Basically, nature and environmentalism is kind of a WASP thing. That's the cliche. It's kind of true.
Mhm.
Madison Grant, the famous eugenicist, was also a famous conservationist.
Right.
So was Lindbergh, also a eugenicist. Not WASP, but German American, I think slash Anglo WASP actually. But so there's that. I didn't see that many wasps. I mean, there were some, but like it wasn't like it's like there's some memes like hiking so white and all this stuff. That I didn't actually see that. I saw a lot of Latinos, frankly, a lot of Asian Americans, like fair number of Asian Americans I saw, and then like all these foreign people. I would say like Yosemite, Kings and Sequoia, like over that like trip this last week, I was like I don't know, it'll be like 15% wasp, right? So national parks are getting used. They're
Great
getting used by
replacement happened.
diverse
Great
what?
replacement. The great
Yeah,
replacement is
yeah, 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 yeah. Because like, well, it's not just like there are these like right wing people that are like, oh, like only like Anglo's care about nature. There's also like woke people that are like, we shouldn't fund the national parks because like only white people hike and go to national parks. Which is like just not true. You know? So I don't know, it's just interesting observation based on, like, what people perceive and the memes they make online. I guess it's like, a lot of the memes on Twitter, like, they're fun, but they're all lies. I mean, a lot of them are just not based on reality, you know?
right. Yeah.
I mean, it's just like it's like, oh, there are these vibes and, there was, like, some, like, video of, like it was a bunch of black people making fun of white people hiking and, like, the way white people they're like, "You're gonna love it," and all this stuff.
Yeah.
I was like, "Okay." It was funny, but, like I didn't see, like, a huge number of black people, but I probably saw as many Black Americans at Yosemite as there are in California proportionally, like 5%,
Uh-huh.
right?
Right. Right.
So it was like, okay, like, black people are hiking too. I mean, not, like, disproportionate, but they are hiking, so I don't know. I think one of the reasons I didn't see as many white people is probably because, like, candidly, a lot of white people are old, and,
That
it's a
might have
little
maybe.
yeah, I think that because I saw a lot of young people with families
I mean, there's
and young
still
people with yeah.
I mean, even like it's still 50% of young people are white though, so it's I mean maybe it's
Not in
less
Cali but not in
California.
California.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not in California. So I think I would see the demographics. I don't know, like, have you been to Big Bend? Like, I haven't been to Big Bend really. I've been through around it, but never in Big Bend in Texas.
I mean, I've been to Big Bend plenty of times, but probably not since the 1990s. Um,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting. I mean, like, there's a book out called Hard Green that I read 25 years ago by Peter Huber. He died
yes,
relatively recently.
good book.
And, one of the things that Huber said was, he was actually supportive like, expanding national forests, and national parks, and, like, his idea is, like, look, when it comes to, like, when it co when it comes to when it comes to our private lands, we should do as much, uh hey,
Hi,
Victoria, we
Victoria.
should do as much, economic maybe we should edit that part out.
This is the episode of cameos. The episode.
Anyway, so, well, it's in the paywall, so who cares? Just a friend, but, anyway, who's staying with me, but, what I was gonna say though is, so it's like in private lands, like, you allow, like, total resource exploitation, whatever. People should be able to do whatever. I don't wanna get into, like, the housing and stuff. I will say with my new job, I have actually seen, even in Austin, like, how onerous, building regulations are, and
Right.
it's out of control. It's
And
out of
Austin's a lot
control.
better
Yes,
than
it makes you a total libertarian when you
yeah.
see it, you know? And so, I don't wanna get into that, but basically, we should allow economic activity on private lands. But when it comes to public lands, that's for a different thing. So it's all, going back to rule of law, it's all about rule of law and predictability. It's like, there's like if you go to Crater Lake, yeah, there are a lot of people, but yeah, like in these Pacific Northwest national parks in particular, there's just so much nature you're gonna starve, you know? It's like a different world. And that's what people are wanting. And also it'll keep a reservoir of, animals and other, I mean, look, we can't have like millions of wolves running around this country, you know? But I don't mind that there are wolves in Yellowstone and stuff like that. Now, if the wolves like go off Yellowstone onto private property and start killing cattle, well, yeah, then you shoot them, right? Because like you don't want wolves running around on your property. It's just like that's the reality. But or grizzly bears, things like that. But nature has its place, and in its place, nature should be natural, right? That's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I'm not a huge nature guy myself, but I'm glad it's out there. I glad.
Well, I mean, you used to have a podcast called Urbane Cowboys,
Right, exactly. Yes,
because
that's right.
you're very urbane. I mean, part of it is like, in places like the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast, nature comes like right close to you. Like a lot of national forests, a lot of federal land, and like the mountains go straight up. So I had a friend who was from Salt Lake, and like her parents' house was like close to the Wasatch, I think, and she could actually she could go mountain climbing with a 5-minute walk. Like,
Yeah.
you could just, like, go straight towards the mountains, and then it's, like, the Wasatch, like, National Reserve or forest, but, like, there's no forest. It's actually, like, just straight up. It's straight up, and she could go mountain climbing. And so, I mean, that's a whole different lifestyle. It's like West Coast versus, Midwest, South, East Coast thing. East Coast, like, there's some, topography, but, in the South, it's, a lot of it's pretty flat. I mean, outside of the Appalachians and, even the hill country here is, like, it's not really that hilly, it's just, it's there, it's got some.
Let me just one semi-random thing because you were talking about the demographics at Yosemite or whatever. So I've noticed that so we have young kids, you take them all sorts of different places, and you notice that even though a lot of these places or things, they're either cheap or they're free or whatever. The Depending on what event you go to, the ethnic breakdown varies quite a bit. So there's a thing. There's an event here um, in Austin every year called Touch a Truck, right? So this is for little kids that have like just a big field, and there'll be a fire engine and a crane and an ambulance, all sorts of different things, and the kids just like get to kind of like run around and jump on them or whatever. And this is free, uh, but I noticed when I was there, I was like, this place is like the families and kids here. It was 90% white and Asian, basically. Very few, even though city of Austin is basically half Hispanic. Or it might not. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
I'll look it up while you're talking.
Yeah. I want to say it's like maybe 40% Hispanic, 40% white, non-Hispanic, 10% black. Um, I don't think Asian is 10%.
Alright,
But
I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna do it really quickly while you, like, think about what you're gonna say.
okay. But
So for
anyway, yeah,
2020, it's 47% non-Hispanic white,
okay,
33% Hispanic. You're within, like, the grade to 9% Asian, 7% Black, 4% mixed. Now, in 1990, when you were growing up, it was 62% non-Hispanic white, 23% Latino, 3% Asian, and 12% Black. But go on.
yeah. But anyway, I mean, you just like there's still a lot of self-sorting. And a year or two ago, we took the kids to strawberry picking. There's like this place, little outside town where you could like pick strawberries or whatever. And for whatever reason, and maybe this was just, the day that we were there, but it was like 80% Indian, right? Like not even, South Asian, Desi, however you want to say it, right? There's just like a few white people and then just like a lot of Indian families. So I don't know like how that got, so there's like lots of like weird lacunae, of the difference, stuff. Now,
Why is strawberry picking Indian?
I don't know. I don't know. I will say, I've also like you go to Chuck E. Cheese and it's like all Hispanic, so it really just depends. It really just depends.
So some ethnographer should do like a study of why is Chuck E. Cheese Hispanic coded, as they would say, Because
Right.
some things you understand, like Popeye's chicken, you get it. You get why it's black coded.
Right. Yeah.
Black people
Exactly.
like chicken, it's just like that's a fact, right?
Like,
Or like,
yeah,
wait, what?
I like fried chicken too.
Okay, well, I would say is actually this is the thing. I have this is my this is what I've noticed. So I think chicken is a southern is a and like I don't consider Austin really the South, but in some ways, Southerners like men from the South will go out to eat and they will order chicken rather than beef.
Right.
Whereas I feel like men outside of the South will never order chicken over beef when they're going out to eat. Like chicken is just like considered a second rate meat, in my opinion,
Yeah.
outside the South. In the South, though, there's more appreciation of poultry. So, yeah, we've got pretty far afield from Pope Francis, so I think we should probably
Right.
just like cut it at this point. But yeah, I guess we'll see you guys next week. We got to figure out some bonus episodes. We get some more guests, and yeah, anyway, a few cameos, but it's fine.
All right. Right.
All right, all right. I'll talk to you later.
All right. See ya.
Two minds met on a summer's eve, each with truths they'd long believed. Words flowed like a winding stream as hours passed in deep debate. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. In listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. In listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. It's not about who's wrong or right, but understanding others' light. In civil discourse, we can find the ties that gently bind. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. As dawn broke soft on dewy grass, they smiled and shook hands at last. Two souls enriched by reason talk, united in respect. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. This folk song captures the essence of a long, thoughtful discussion between two public intellectuals. It emphasizes the power of patient listening, mutual respect, and the discovery of common ground. The gentle tone reflects the common understanding they reach after their debate. Would you like me to expand on any aspects of the lyrics or discuss the theme?